Hi, Dr. Miller. I'm gonna do my presentation. I decided to do my model or crisis intervention model um, to serve the homeless and runaway LGBTQ youth community. Um, why the interest? As you may know, as I mentioned in class, um, but when I was in Illinois, I worked as a crisis manager or a crisis intervention manager, and I work with homeless youth and runaway youth. I work with the state of Illinois and their CCBYS program. CCBYS stands for Community Comprehensive Based Youth Services, and they basically deal and fund different nonprofit organizations to respond to crises um, when a person between the ages of 11 to 17 gets runs away from home or is kicked out of the home, and we go in there and um, uh, provide stabilization services for the youth. In this kind of work, I came across a few. I think about 10 to 15% of all the youth that we helped or we provide crisis intervention work for were LGBTQ youth. And it was difficult not just for us and the crisis workers, but also for the shelters, specifically especially the shelters. They a lot of the times didn't know how to handle. They were sometimes insensitive from the work that I saw happening to LGBTQ youth, and then they didn't really create a very safe space for the youth that were shelters. So I decided that to do more research on this topic and see if there really was a need. So what I found was that about 20 to 40% of all homeless youth identify as part of the LGBTQ community in the United States, which is really high actually because according to some other studies, only about 5 to 10% of the population um, identifies as LGBTQ. Um, so 20 to 40% is disproportionate to the disproportionate, and it's overrepresentative of the LGBTQ community. They also reported there were differences in the reasons why the youth were homeless. They surveyed all of the youth, all homeless youth, and the LGBTQ reported that the number one reason why they were because they faced rejection by the family members, and therefore they decided to run away from their homes on their own accord. The second most common reason was that they were actually kicked out of their homes after coming out to their families. And then the other reason that was commonly reported was that they became too old for the foster care system, or they fled because they reported being victims of physical violence and harassment due to their sexual orientation. Um, and this is versus the reasons reported by heterosexual youth. The main reason was that they faced conflict with their parents because they wanted more freedom, or because they were evicted from their homes by the government, or for whatever other reasons. So there were differences in the reasons why these two groups of people reported being homeless. There's also the other studies that I found. They reported higher risk for the LGBTQ youth. They said that they were more likely to be victims of physical abuse, more likely to use alcohol and drugs, and also not just to use more likely to use, but also they were more likely to use alcohol and drugs more frequently than non-LGBTQ identified youth. The same was true about engaging in unprotected sex and having more sexual partners and engaging in survival sex. And that is sex in exchange for shelter, food, and among other things. The study that they did found that the LGBTQ youth did admit to using more drugs than non-LGBTQ youth, and also were 70% more likely to engage in risky consensual sex. LGBTQ youth were also um, at a greater risk of other negative consequences of homelessness than heterosexual youth. Studies show that they were more likely to commit suicide, PTSD, and have suicidal ideation. So overall, they were at a higher risk than than those youth that don't identify as LGBTQ. So what has already been done? Not enough. The staff at the majority of shelters reported that they didn't really know what to do or how to work with the LGBTQ youth, and sometimes even might discriminate against them, against this population. There are a few shelters that cater specifically to the LGBTQ population. One study actually mentioned that there were 25 in the entire country, but that's actually kind of low, considering there's 50 states and there's only um, 25 shelters specifically catering services to the LGBTQ community. Another study found that out of 354 shelters surveyed, 85% said they believed to be fairly competent when working with LGBT. However, there were no studies done, and there haven't been any studies done to go into the shelters and actually assess um, the work they do with the LGBTQ community. Um, so I thought that it would be a good idea to provide shelters with the tools to work with LGBTQ youth. I proposed to introduce an LGBT readiness training and introduce shelters to a crisis model to use specifically in working with this population. So it would be a two-part model or two-phase model. The first phase would require training for the staff to be educated on LGBTQ issues and to help the shelter create a safe space for LGBTQ youth. The second phase would actually introduce a crisis intervention model that can best serve this population. The core ideas behind the model, the first one is that I used an systems approach that highlights the specific stressors of homeless and runaway LGBTQ youth. Then the actual crisis model is structured, or it mirrors the six-step intervention model introduced by Gilligan in 1982 that was described in class, and we talked about it extensively. I also will talk about how to incorporate a gay affirmative approach to the intervention model, and I also followed the recommendations that were proposed by the National Alliance to End Homelessness in 2009. They filed a report and said, hey, this is the things that you should do. So those were the core ideas behind what I used to create this model. The ecological systems. The ecological systems theory just says that there are different levels of in a person's life: the micro level, the meso level, and the macro level. The micro level is something that it's individual and more individual. For example, like mental health or problems that affect the individual person. The meso level is kind of like the circle around us, our families, peers, and schools, for example. Those are like the immediate things. So if you think of it as kind of like, um, yeah, like a circle, the first circle will be the individual, then whoever is closest to us, and then the macro level, of course, will be society itself, societal cultures, other bigger things. Um, a study found that there were indeed differences and more negative consequences that people faced at each of these levels, or LGBTQ youth face at each of these levels. At the micro level, or social problems were um, mental health, substance use and abuse, and sexual behaviors, which also are, if you remember from the literature before, those are the main things that youth were more likely to be at risk for. Um, the meso-level psychosocial problems were difficulties in communication between families, peer behaviors, and in school engagement. Although the last one, school engagement, they didn't really find any big differences among LGBTQ youth and non-LGBTQ youth. This means the dropout rates. The dropout rates were the same among non-LGBTQ youth and LGBTQ youth. And then finally, the macro level problems, which were stigma, and the major ones were stigma and discrimination that primarily LGBTQ youth face, and not heterosexual youth. So those were the levels. The next step crisis intervention model that we talked about in class, it breaks down the 6 steps how to intervene in a crisis. The first one is to identify the problem. Number two, ensure client safety. Three, provide support. Um, four, to examine alternatives. And five, make plans. And then finally, to obtain commitment. And usually this is just done in one sitting. This is also the model that it's not the exact model, but it's something that we used in the state of Illinois as well. It doesn't break it down like that. It's a little bit more, it's different, but I can see how it bases off this model. And that's the reason why I decided to use this model because um, while I was doing this project, the main state that I had in mind was my state, and how I could use this model and introduce this and change it so that it caters to LGBTQ youth, and then implement it in the state of Illinois. Of course, there's other states that also use similar models. I know Indiana and Ohio, at least, also have the CCBYS program, and they use similar models, and they already train their staff to follow something similar to this model. So I thought it would be best practice to use this model so that you wouldn't really be, when it's implemented, the staff already know and have an idea of how to do this. And what my model will be doing will just be kind of introducing specific tools and specific interventions aimed at LGBTQ youth. Um, so I mentioned that there was the National Alliance to End Homelessness that made some suggestions as to how shelters can best serve the LGBTQ youth population. These were the guidelines that they said that the shelter should use. The first one was to establish non-discrimination, anti-harassment, and confidentiality policies that address sexual orientation and gender identity, and creates safe and inclusive agency environments. Number two would be to enhance LGBTQ cultural competency among the staff through training and other supports. Provide flexible and tailored programming for LGBTQ youth, including interventions that focus on family acceptance and reunification, addressing the unique health and shelter needs of transgender clients, and establishing connections with other organizations serving LGBTQ youth. So these are the ideas that I also got and implemented it into the model. Um, so the first phase, educating the staff and establishing a safe space for the LGBTQ youth. So the first phase would require the implementer, me, to assess the LGBT competency among the staff, and then provide appropriate education and support. So you're just going, I will be going and assessing what the shelter staff already knows about the LGBT community, and then providing the adequate information um, for them. So we will be discussing how to discuss sexuality in a non-shaming, non-judgmental manner, and then also help the staff connect and become familiarized with other organizations that serve the LGBTQ community already in their communities. A lot of the times there already are organizations that are specifically catering to the LGBTQ community in general, and it would be a good idea to identify what those are and then introduce them to the shelter and link them so they can work together. And that includes nonprofit organizations, churches, and maybe even support groups that are not necessarily an entire organizations, but there are available in the community. And then the other thing would be to change the space to be more welcoming of LGBTQ youth. And that includes putting up symbols that represent the LGBTQ community, like the gay flag, the equality sign, or the safe zone space on the upside down triangle. And basically it says that it represents the area or the space is a space of respect for everybody. So that would be the first phase of the problem of when going into a shelter and implementing this program. The other thing would be to introduce the gay affirmative approach. It's still in the first step. The staff will also receive proper training to incorporate gay affirmative practice. Gay affirmative practice is not a standalone approach of therapy in itself. It is actually a practice that can be incorporated into any treatment model. The approach actually has shown to improve treatment effectiveness among LGBTQ patients because it views homosexuality as normal and affirms that LGBTQ youth identity is an equally valid and positive expression of sexuality, just like being heterosexual is. Furthermore, someone who practices gay affirmative approach celebrates and supports the LGBTQ people and acknowledges the negative impact homophobia and heterosexism can have on the LGBTQ in the lives of LGBTQ people. Um, there is another thing that I didn't include in my paper, but I probably should have, and it's this kind of like a pamphlet or handout that also explains gay affirmative therapy, um, and it's right there on the screen. So it's an approach to therapy that embraces a positive view of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer identities. It gives you definitions of what each of what the terms are for the LGBTQ community, um, and then it gives you tips. Um, gives you tips for affirmative therapists. Number one would be to talk about LGBTQ affirmative stance to colleagues, potential clients, family, and friends. To be aware of your own heteronormative and gender normative assumptions and challenge oppression. Um, Other tips would be using correct terminology when in doubt, when you don't know what to call your client, I'll just ask. To get involved in the LGBT community in events and activities, and then access LGBTQ affirmative continuing education trainings and resources for your clinical practice. So this is an ongoing thing. It's not just something that will be provided in one session, but um, the staff should be aware that this is something that they should keep in the back of their minds. Okay, let's back to the PowerPoint. There we go. Okay, so that's the gay affirmative approach. So the phase two would actually be the actual crisis intervention model. The first step, which is similar to the intervention model, is to define the problem and also to do a needs assessment for the LGBTQ youth. The staff must gather the following information: does the youth identify as LGBTQ? What are the reasons why the youth is at the shelter? Were they kicked out of the house? Did they decide to leave on their own? Um, and then also, is the youth still in contact with the family? And this is very important because then you can start, and later on when you're making a plan, you can talk about whether it would be a good idea to um, to go back home. And that's why you should also ask any physical abuse directed at the youth by the family due to the youth's identification with the LGBT community. So these are very important to know right away so that later when you're in step 4 or 5, when you're making the plan, then you would know if it would be appropriate to talk about being reunited with the family. And I included this because one of the main, in the state of Illinois, CCBYS, one of their goals is actually reunification with the family. So it should be the same with the LGBTQ youth. But of course, if there is violence or immediate danger to the youth, then that's a step that goal shouldn't be one of the goals for that particular youth. So that's the first step. Step 2 would be to ensure the client's safety. This already has kind of been done. If the shelter already has like a welcoming environment. They have like the gay flag or something, so that the youth who identifies as LGBTQ, um, they already feel accepted, or at least not accepted, but at least they already know that this is a place where they can be themselves. Um, then also this would also not only that's just to be safe, but actually assess for safety. Like for example, um, does the youth have any health needs? Is the youth has the youth contemplated suicide or is contemplating suicide now? Are there any risky behaviors? Have they been engaging in unsafe sex for, like I said, survival needs? Are they harming themselves? And are they using drugs or alcohol? And this is basically to assess any of these things that we already know that the youth are already more likely to do. So we just want to assess and make sure them, and so we can include that in the plan. To we'll have it in the back of our heads to introduce certain interventions that will help the youth that describe being at risk of any of these behaviors. Step three, or the third step, to provide support or look for outside support for the client. In this stage, the staff will make sure to create an environment where the LGBTQ not only feels safe, but also feels supported. Supported. You might be the first, or the staff might be the first person that, or grown up that has expressed support for the youth. So it's very important. They would also ensure to link the youth to the appropriate outside resources based on the assessment results, like I talked about before. The staff can refer the client for individual therapy, group therapy, or recommend a specific skill building workshop offered by the shelter. It was my experience working with shelters that they already offer a lot of coping skills, solving problem skills, and job education training. So if the so based on the assessment of needs, then they can refer this type of work to the youth in case they need it. The therapist must also help the client identify their supportive network, friends or extended family that can be viewed as allies. If the client if in the first step the client identify their family as being still in contact, then the staff can ask if their immediate family can be seen as a potential source of support. If the youth says that that might be an option, then the staff can serve as a mediator during conversations with the family and the youth to talk about being reunited at home and what are the issues that they can work on, and then eventually refer the family and the youth to family therapy to work on the issues that led to the homelessness place. The fourth step would be to examine alternatives. So this step would move the client to start thinking about their plans for the future. The staff will bring up the option of reunification with the family again. If returning home is a potential threat for the youth, of course, then that we would shelf that idea. If returning home is not an option, then the staff can assist the LGBTQ youth to find transitional living programs, and these are often already linked to the shelters or part of the shelters program. At least in Illinois, they are. Another option would be to stay temporarily with a potential with any relatives that were identified before as allies, um, and then of course develop a plan to slowly transition back home or transition to a transitional living program, whichever is more appropriate in this step. But basically, this step also is kind of introducing problem skills. What are your options, and trying the youth to think in a solution-focused way. The fifth step to actually would be to actually make a plan. So this will involve both the staff and the LGBTQ youth to come up with a suitable intervention. Now that they talked about the alternatives, let's talk about a plan. What would be the best way for to go about, or what are the best steps to take in order to improve your situation? So the staff member here would provide appropriate referrals for the youth, recommend certain skill development groups, like I said, maybe a coping group, problem-solving group, self-esteem, or job readiness program, depending on what the client identified as his or her goals. So if the plan is my family, or the story is my family kicked me out, there is no way for me to go back home because I've experienced physical abuse, um, and I already am suicidal and blah blah blah. These are all the things that you've already identified. Then in this step, you would make a plan based on those needs, referring the client to individual therapy, referring them to group work, providing coping skill workshops to help the youth deal with the rejection from the family and to build their self-esteem. And then, of course, the job readiness program, because the youth identified wanting to move to a transitional living home. And a lot of the time, they require the youth to work. So job readiness program or group would be most appropriate here. And then finally, obtaining commitment. And then this is also ongoing commitment. So it's this last step is actually implementation of the plan. The staff member would summarize the plan and would provide case management. A lot of the shelters already have managers, and they would just um, provide the youth with a case manager to help them follow the steps that were provided in the plan, um, and to provide support, ongoing support, as long as the youth is at the shelter. and even after they have gone from the shelter, the referrals, then making sure that the youth follows those referrals so that they're not alone going through this transition of being kicked out of the home and being moved to a transitional living program. Or if they are, for example, going back home, then providing the referral to family therapy so that the family and the youth can work on their issues um, about how to live together again now that that the youth has come out of the closet. But those are the 6 steps. The main goal is of the model is primarily to stabilize an the LGBTQ youth in crisis by providing a safe space for the LGBTQ identified youth. The proposed model doesn't then the purpose is not to directly deal and process the traumatic experience of unexpected homelessness, but at the different stages, this crisis model does provide interventions that can reduce stress in the 3 systemic levels previously discussed, thereby reducing the chance of further trauma and not drama, trauma, and providing coping skills to better deal with the trauma. For example, like if the group therapy or family therapy will be dealing with the micro levels psychosocial problems. The mediation with the family will deal with the meso levels, with the communication with family, and then coping skills and problem solving can help with coping with discrimination and homophobia or example. Other goals of of this model is to provide the LGBT identified youth with community resources, to highlight and build on the LGBTQ youth strengths, and then finally to start and facilitate the process of family reunification um, for the identified youth, or ease the LGBTQ identified youth into a traditional living program. So those are the goals, and that is basically my idea for the crisis intervention work. Some of the stuff that um, still might need to work on will be transgender issues, and then also there isn't there aren't a lot of studies done on this subgroup of the LGBTQ community, as well as the differences between LGBTQ of color and LGBTQ youth um, that are not of color. So I think those will be areas of interest that can be incorporated into the crisis model. But I just decided to do a more general um, intervention, and that's it. Thank you.